Well, good morning, River Run. I'm Caleb. Yeah, that's right. I'm Caleb, and I'm part of the teaching team here, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to, one, get to open up this series, but two, I'm really grateful that I need this message myself. I need this. I think sometimes there maybe is a disconnect in the church nowadays where there's, a stage and a pulpit or a table and a TV and lights, that if you're in the seats, you need it. If you're up here, you already got it. But that's not actually true. Even this morning, I found myself, you guys ever seen the movie Bambi? You know when Bambi gets out on the ice and just like what the heck is going on, skating around with the wobbly legs? I felt very much, I walked in this morning feeling like that. And as we get into this series, Unshakable, I just want to acknowledge that reality. Even in the passage from 1 Peter that's being read there in 1 Peter chapter 5, the statement from Peter is that, hey, everyone who's following Jesus in all the world is experiencing the same kinds of sufferings as you are. Sufferings, trouble, challenges. And it says in there, cast all your anxieties upon the Lord. Wait, I can have anxieties and be unshakable at the same time? Isn't being unshakable, doesn't that mean I don't have anything I'm worried about? No, that's not what it means at all, thank God. But I need this. I need this because I easily find my own self shaken by circumstances of life that do not go the way I wish they would, by realities of my life that are permanently probably true, that are not what I wish they were if I was in control of my life, but I'm not. So I need something more to rely on than my circumstances today. And this series, these 3 weeks that we're going to spend in this, in this theme of being unshakable, are going to invite us to look to things that are beyond our circumstances and beyond our own control in order to have a sturdier version of life than we would ever have apart from it. And we're going to jump right in here in just a minute, but just quick story. When I was a kid, one of my favorite places to go as a kid, and probably my dad's favorite way to take us somewhere fun for free, was we would go to the 40. It's about an hour drive from where I lived growing up. And the 40 is very creatively titled the 40 because it was 40 acres that my grandpa owned. And he owned it up in northern Michigan out in the woods. And we would drive there. And when we go there, my favorite thing to do when we were there walking around the woods was to pretend I was Chuck Norris. And I would look for trees that I could knock down. I would. And you know what I'd look for? I'd look for birch trees. I'd look for birch trees that'd be standing out there, and they're kind of like standing dead, essentially, right? And I would go over, and I would even do like kind of something like, what'd you say? Got something to say to me? I'm talking to a tree, just so everybody understands. What? And then, bah, and knock that tree right down. That was impressive. I pulled something, but I'll be fine. And I'd knock it down, or maybe I'd run full speed and blast it down. You had to be really selective on the trees you chose, though, right? I needed to choose trees that could not withstand the pressure of me coming against them. And I would always choose these birch trees and over again. And if I went right now, if I go to Michigan to this day and I can figure out time to get to the 40, which they sold some, it's 32, but it still sounds better to say 40. You know what I'm going to look for? Birch trees that I can knock down and pretend I'm Chuck Norris. Are you kidding me? I'm still going to do it. We see birch trees, they grow quickly, but they have a shallow root system, and as a result, they're more vulnerable to being uprooted. They're less resilient than trees that are around that have a deeper root system, and so they cannot withstand the same pressure other trees can. They can't withstand the same trials that other trees can because they lack deep roots. And then I moved here to Florida. I remember the first time I was here and a storm rolled through. One of the hurricanes came by, and I don't remember which one it was. It was probably 2016, something like that. And at that time, the ministry that I work with, Emmaus Ministries, we were based on a large campus here in Oviedo, a retreat center. And there were all these big, giant trees, these giant oak trees that were really impressive. They looked incredibly strong. And I was shocked after the storm blew through to walk around that property and see these giant trees laying all over the place. And that's when I found out about water oaks and these shallow root systems, these trees that grow really fast and really strong and have this appearance of strength, this really huge tree, but that has actually really shallow roots. So it makes them more vulnerable and less resilient. More vulnerable and less resilient because they don't have the root system that other trees have. And so two trees can experience the same storm. They could experience the same pressure. One falls and the other stands. And I think that image is good to have in mind. In fact, it's the central image that is going to be used by the primary passage we'll be in today in Jeremiah chapter 16 and 17. So if you got your Bibles, you can flip there. We'll mainly be right there. Otherwise, it'll be on the screen or in your digital guide or weekly guide, I think I call it now. I can never remember the right term. I always mess it up. But if you scan that QR code in front of you, you can follow along there. But in Jeremiah, that's what Jeremiah is going to use as a central image. But what I want to do is I want to pray for a minute and then jump into the passage today. We'll be cruising right along. So God, right now, I just give you myself, we give you ourselves, and we ask, Lord, in the next few minutes here as we're together in your word, speak to us. Speak to us in ways that I cannot speak to us. Holy Spirit, we just thank you that you're already here. We welcome you to lead, to teach, and to change us in order that we might experience a more unshakable life because you are an unshakable God. In Jesus' name, amen. So Jeremiah 16, he opens up with this. In verse 19, he says, Lord, you are my strength and fortress, my refuge in the what? That's not a trick question. In the what? Yeah, in the day of trouble. Good job, good job. Excellent work. In the day of trouble. So these two realities Jeremiah opens with in verse 19 and says, there is a day of trouble, and in the day of trouble, I have strength. But that strength is the Lord. Now he's basically, the rest of these verses is going to invite everyone else to join him in that same posture of his life. In the day of trouble, I have strength, a fortress, and a refuge. Now, just quick little context. Jeremiah did not think of the day of trouble as some future day that was going to be really bad. Jeremiah's life, he spent decades as a prophet, a messenger, or minister of God to the people of Judah, the southern kingdom, as they were turning from God and worshiping idols. For years and years and years, people hated his messages and rejected his ministry. For years and years and years, kings took his written works of his messages, burned them in fires. He was arrested. He was beaten. He was tossed into a pit. He was mocked. He was called a liar. So Jeremiah had a whole lot of days of trouble. And not only that, but the people he is writing to, they experienced days of trouble. See, in the days Jeremiah is writing this message to send it to people, he's sending it to the people of Judah who are living now no longer in their land, but far off in the land of Babylon. They've watched the political structure of their nation crumble. They've watched the economy crumble. They've seen as an invading empire of Babylon came in and for the last 20 years has been carrying people away and forcing them into heavy taxation. They watched then as ultimately Babylon came in, destroyed Jerusalem, tore down their temple, killed the sons of their kings, and marched many of them hundreds of miles away into Babylon. So I just want to give us context here that when you ask the people, anyone in the Bible, about days of trouble, they don't think about some bad day way off in the distant future. They look at their current life and recognize, oh yeah, I know days of trouble. I'm acquainted with those. But in Jeremiah 16, verse 19, he says that I have strength in the day of trouble. And then he points to the nations and says they do not. And here's what he says in verse 20. Nations from around the world will come to you and say, our ancestors left us a foolish heritage, for they worshipped worthless idols. Can people make their own gods? We try, right? But can people make their own gods? These are not real gods at all. And I got the extra hour because the time changed, so I told Bobby in the back, I'm going to go an extra hour in the sermon, so hang on. And then it will help you guys get all balanced back out. It's for your good. So here's what they're presented with. That Jeremiah says, hey, in the day of trouble, I'm okay. But in the day of trouble, the nations say, these aren't real gods at all. These things are worthless to us. And here's the main point we're going to work from. Days of trouble reveal what we trust. Days of trouble reveal what we trust. Now, if you were the people of Judah and you were in Babylon in exile and you had lost your home, you'd lost your farmland, you'd lost your flocks and herds, you maybe had lost some family members, and you were oppressed by the Babylonians, and you thought, I need a solution to the trouble I'm experiencing, what might you think? Oh, I know the solution. End the problem. Right? Hey, God, I know what you need to do to make this trouble go away. You need to take me back home, give me back my house, give me back the farmland, restore my family, and get rid of these dirty, rotten Babylonians. And that's what most of us would think. The human heart would think the way to solve, the solution to a day of trouble is to end the trouble. But that's not the message the Jews receive. And it's actually not the message the Bible gives to any of us. Oh, the problem will end. Now, the promise is that there will be a day when all trouble will cease. But in the meantime, the solution is not the end of the trouble, but a change of your trust. The solution that's presented now to the people of Judah is to find the right source to trust in even while the trouble hasn't ended yet. Because the reality is, if trouble ends, but we trust in the wrong thing still, then what will we do? Create new trouble, different trouble, and maybe even more trouble. So the Bible is very honest. And let me just, if you're new to this, or you're thinking about becoming a Christian, and you feel the Lord may be pulling you, and let me fold it. All the cards are on the table. Following Jesus does not mean your life will not have any trouble. All right? Can I get an amen? All right. Yeah, amen. All right. Okay, come on. It does not mean you will not have trouble. In fact, let me give you some quotes. In the world you will have trouble. Jesus, that's Jesus. John 16:33. In this world you will face trials of various kinds. That's James 1 verse 2. In this world you will face sufferings. That's Paul in Romans 8:18. In this world you will be grieved by various trials. That's Peter in 1 Peter 1 verse 6. Trouble will come, and trouble reveals what we trust. It both reveals the object we trust in, and trouble tends to reveal the quality of what we are trusting in. How reliable is it actually? How reliable is it actually? And what the nations noticed, Jeremiah says, is that idols work great when all they're doing is helping you get what you want. But idols stop seeming to work when they're required to actually be your God. Right? That there's things that work when we're just trying to gratify what we want. But once we need to be held, once we need to be loved, once we need to be kept secure and safe and held strong in the midst of trouble, those idols, they're useless. They're useless. But it's trouble that reveals that. And I said something years ago that I was thinking again this week, that it is a blessing when trouble reveals to us that the thing we're trusting in isn't good enough. It's a blessing to us because it invites us to trust in something better. So Jeremiah goes on in verse 1, and he says this. He's describing the way that Judah has been, that they've not trusted in God. But instead of just saying you don't trust, he uses the word sin. And he says this: the sin of Judah is inscribed with an iron chisel, engraved with a diamond point on their stone hearts and on the corners of their altars. Now, I'd love to get into that more, but we can't. But basically what that's saying is that the people of Judah, they aren't trusting in the God that would be a fortress in a day of trouble. They're trusting in other things. And it's carved into their heart, this distrust in God. It's in their hearts and it's on their altars, which means that for them, the heart was the center of their personal life with God. It was the place of their intentions and their desires and their choices. The point there is, in their inner secret life, they don't trust God, and their altars were places of public worship of different idols and gods of the nations. It says, in public and in private, instead of trusting in me, you trust in lesser things. And it goes on in verse 2 and describes the impact of that. It says, even their children go to worship at their pagan altars, which means other gods. And their Asherah poles. Asherah was one of those pagan gods, but was a fertility goddess that was supposed to help them to have more offspring and secure families. And there was sexual perversion tied to that worship beneath every green tree and on every high hill. So what is going on is that not only are they themselves have decided to trust in something that's not really reliable, to trust in something other than God, but the next generation is learning to trust just like they do. And there is a reality of that. And if there's one thing I want my kids to know about me, it's that I trust God. They may know a lot of things, and they may see a lot of things where I'm like, hey, yeah, don't do that. Yeah, don't lose your temper that way. Don't say that thing. But I want them to know that their dad, he trusts God. And what's happening here is Jeremiah looks and says, generations are learning that though God has rescued you, you trust in other things. You trust in other things to give you security and peace and joy and life. And then he goes on, and this is that central image that we have in verses 5 through 8. And this calls back to the birch trees I was kicking down like Chuck Norris and the water oaks that fell down all over the property here in Florida. Jeremiah then begins to describe to them two ways of living this life. Two ways of experiencing trial and trouble in this life. And he says this. This is what the Lord says. Cursed are those who put their trust in mere humans, who rely on human strength and turn their hearts away from the Lord. They are like stunted shrubs in the desert with no hope for the future. They will live in the barren wilderness in an uninhabited, salty land. Next verse continues on and says, but blessed are those who trust in the Lord and have made the Lord their hope and confidence. They are like trees planted along a riverbank with roots that reach deep into the water. Such trees are not bothered by the heat or worried by long months of drought. Their leaves stay green and they never stop producing fruit. Now, I want to just help you here. I put a little chart here on the screen, and you'll see it here. The contrast between these two ways of life, these two illustrations that Jeremiah sets before the people. They are in a time of trouble, and they have two forms of a tree that they can become: stunted shrubs or deep-rooted trees. So what do they look like? Stunted shrubs. They trust in humans. They rely on human strength. They turn their hearts away from the Lord, and their circumstances are like they end up being in a desert, barren, uninhabited wilderness. And for the stunted shrubs, they have no hope for the future whenever the future seems to get threatened. There's no hope. But the deep-rooted trees are those who trust in the Lord. They make the Lord their hope and confidence. We'll come back to that in a moment. They are planted along a riverbank. Their roots are deep in the water. So just picture the image here of, I think about tumbleweed. Like my dad raised me on like old Wild West movies, cowboy movies. And it's like, and they're out there, and all of a sudden the tumbleweed goes blowing across. At one point it did grow up out of the ground, but the roots were so shallow and there was no nourishment to it, and just the slightest little kick or a blow of the wind, and there it went. And Jeremiah says that is one way to experience this life, that the slightest trouble will send you spiraling. But there's another way, the way of the deep-rooted tree, where you're planted by a riverbank. Your roots run down so deep that they can drink in water and nourishment from an ever-flowing source of that river, no matter what season you go through. Because look at this. The deep-rooted trees, they experience the scorching heat of the sun, and they experience drought, but they are not bothered and they are not worried. They are not bothered and they are not worried. Why? Because it might not rain in my circumstances today, but I have a source that's deeper than today's rain. I can drink in deeply from the ever-flowing river that's right here. I'm planted along these banks, and I can draw life and security and strength from that source, even when the circumstances of my life are in trouble. So Jeremiah is presenting them two questions. Number one, which one do you feel like now? And I'll say the same thing to us. Just consider, which one of these trees do you feel like in your present life? And if you are the people reading Jeremiah's message, I know your answer. You feel like a stunted shrub that has blown hundreds of miles away and now is sitting in Babylon in captivity. Okay, which one do you want to become? And this is both an opportunity to examine where am I at right now, and also an opportunity to reorient which one do I want to be. Because the invitation of this passage is, if you want to be a deeply rooted tree, then you just need to trust in the Lord, instead of trusting in human strength and human leaders and human resources. You see, for the stunted shrubs, it says they have no hope. But for the deep-rooted trees, it says they make the Lord their hope and their confidence. So and you can write this down if you want, or just reflect on it for a minute. For the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving, but I think this is an invitation to think on these two things. Make the Lord your hope. When I think about the hope, we think about what's ahead, what is certain. But when you think about the stability of your future, what is it that comes to mind? And don't say it out loud. And don't try to think of the answer that you're supposed to give at church. Like, just think honestly. When you think about the stability of your future, of my future, what is it for us that comes to mind? And then we have to ask ourselves, can I guarantee that that will be there? Can I guarantee that person, that relationship, that money, that property, that thing will be there? If not, then maybe my hope needs to be in something more secure. And my confidence. They make the Lord their confidence. Confidence. Think about your security in the present moment. What is it in your life that makes you feel secure in your present life? And let's get real about it. Are you absolutely certain you can guarantee it will be there in 6 months? That number in this account, or that person in my life, or that physical health, or that job and future career, are you certain that those things will still be there? Because if not, it's worth considering, is there something better to put my confidence in? And that's the invitation that Jeremiah is making to them, and it's the invitation God is making to us. Do you feel like a stunted shrub blowing through the desert? Or do you feel like an oak that if drought comes, you're not going to be shaken, because you believe you will still have green life of leaves and you will still bear fruit? He takes aim then in the next couple verses, and I'll quickly go through these, but at two of the main leanings and the consequence of this. And he says this, that like a partridge in verse 11, like a partridge that hatches eggs she has not laid. We all think about that all the time, right? That's a joke. We don't. All right. But that's what Jeremiah says. Like a partridge that hatches eggs she has not laid, meaning taking what's not hers. So are those who get their wealth by unjust means. Those who get their wealth by unjust means, which means I trust in wealth to provide me with security, so much so that I am willing to take from you to make my throne greater. People who are living for their own throne, trusting in what they can build for themselves. He says, at midlife, they'll lose their riches, In the end, they will become poor old fools. Come on, that's rude. All right? They will become poor old fools. But we, he says in verse 12, but we worship at your throne, eternal, high, and glorious. He contrasts the trust in a new way here. He says, there are those who trust in what they can get for themselves and the throne they can accumulate for themselves, and there are those who trust in the throne of God. Stunted shrubs end up empty. Deep-rooted trees that stay secure. And then he goes on and says in verse 13, O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who turn away from you will be disgraced. They will be buried in the dust of the earth, for they have abandoned the Lord, the fountain of living water. They've abandoned the Lord, the fountain of living water. Those who turn away from the Lord turn away from a fountain of living water. Put a pin there. We'll come right back to that in a moment. And then he contrasts it a little bit later in verse 17 when he says, Lord, for me, you alone are my hope in the day of disaster. I have found something to trust in that is more reliable than riches, more reliable than career, more reliable than fame, more reliable than a throne I can get for myself. I have found something that makes me unshakable even when disaster hits. It is the Lord. It is the Lord. Fountain of living water. Now, in the days when Jeremiah is writing, a fountain of living water was a really big deal to find. There was two ways to kind of try to get the water you needed to survive. One was to find a ever-flowing, constant, reliable source of clean water, a spring or a fountain of living water. The other was to dig these cisterns where water would collect. The rain, but you could go and get buckets or get, maybe not buckets, but you'd go collect water from the river, come and you'd put it there in this cistern that you found for yourself, and that water that you got for yourself could stay in that kind of little container. Now the problem was with this water is that eventually it was gone. And the problem with this water is that eventually it would go bad. So the very clear choice when given the options would always be to go to the fountain if you had it. Why would you choose something that is temporary, that goes bad, and that is completely reliant upon how much you can get done for yourself? Why? When there is a God-made source that is ever flowing right here. Well, this image of the fountain of living water, Jeremiah has used it way back in chapter 2. And he says this in Jeremiah 2, verse 13. Actually, God speaking to Jeremiah and says this, my people have done two evil things. They have abandoned me, the fountain of living water, and they have dug for themselves cracked cisterns that can hold no water at all. You have to imagine what that's like. It means you're still doing all the work and you're still hoping that that will be your source, but when you really need it, it's empty. Right? Having a cracked cistern is different than having no cistern at all. Because a cracked cistern, you're collecting the water, you're putting in all your strength to try to make sure you're going to have what you need, but there's a crack in it. So when you actually need it, it's empty. It's empty. And here's the point Jeremiah and the Lord are making for the people of Judah this time. Trust in the wrong thing is not only unhelpful, trust in the wrong thing ends up creating more trouble. Trust in the wrong thing ends up creating more trouble. Because to have a cracked cistern means that you'll wait till you're thirsty or you're really in need, and then you'll go and you'll find yourself empty when you are desperate. But the Lord says, I want to be your fountain. I want to be your fountain. I want you to rely on me. I want you to know that every time you are thirsty for a drink, the water will be there for you. The day of trouble reveals what we trust. And the Lord invites us to trust in Him. In Matthew chapter 7, so we're jumping to the Old Testament. King Jesus, we've been in this series, King Jesus and His Kingdom, and King Jesus is doing he taught many times, explaining what it looks like really to trust in Him. And one of the longest portions of that is Matthew 5 through 7, called the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus, the King, the Son of God, the fountain Himself in the flesh, stood before these people on the mountain. And after explaining the kingdom, His kingdom, and how to follow Him and trust in Him, He uses this analogy, which sounds very familiar to Jeremiah's analogy. Matthew 7, 24 through 27. He says, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on solid rock. Though the rain comes in torrents, and the floodwaters rise, and the winds beat against that house, it won't collapse, because it is built on bedrock. It goes on, but, it says, anyone who hears my teaching and ignores it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. When the rains and floods come, and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. So Jesus now, hundreds of years after Jeremiah, again stands before people who God wants to trust in Him. And Jesus says to them, there are two ways to build your life, on the sand or on the rock. And you'll see again, we have a little chart. I like it to help me sort out everything that's said. The house on sand hears Jesus and what He has to say, but ignores Him, meaning doesn't trust Him. The house on the rock listens and follows Jesus, or trusts Jesus. This is the fool, this is the wise. But look at this, this is what I want us to see. The rain, the winds, and the floods come for both houses. All right? Here's what Jesus doesn't say. The one who builds their house on the bedrock will also have a dome placed over them. And while everyone else is getting crushed by wind and waves and rain and floods, they will not. They'll be sitting on the back porch sipping their tea, watching, oh, those poor peasants getting smoked by the floods, you know? No! It hits them both. But one collapses and the other stands. The same idea Jeremiah presented. And the invitation is the same. Consider which one your life feels like right now, and consider which one you want to be. Because there is one simple movement that changes the foundation of our life. Trust. Trust. Trouble will come, but trust in the Lord keeps our hearts secure. Trouble will come, but trust in the Lord keeps our hearts secure. Hey, Nate mentioned it earlier. Guess what? Between now and next Sunday, trouble might come in some ways. For some of us, this next week is going to be troubling for us. We're going to look around and we're going to be troubled by we might be troubled by some things going on in our nation or in our communities or in the political world. We might find some things that trouble us. That may happen. Let me also be honest. 6 months from now, for some of us, this week is going to be the least troubling thing that happens in our life. Some of us are going to, we might lose a family member. We might experience a significant diagnosis change. We might experience financial loss, job loss. We might move, have to relocate, have the loss of a relationship. Trouble will come. But may we be like Jeremiah. The Lord is my strength, my fortress, a refuge in the day of trouble. In the day of trouble. See, here's what we find out. There are two guarantees, and one we'll talk about next week. The trouble I'm experiencing right now it will not be forever. It will end. But right now, there is one who is with me that invites this reality, that the trouble around me does not have to become trouble within me. The trouble around me does not have to become trouble within me, because the Lord is with me. And I was thinking about this passage as we move to our response time. In Mark chapter 4, I want you just to listen to this. Because in Unshakable, I don't want us to think this is about you being unshakable and so strong. Because often I feel just like these disciples. As evening came, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's cross the other side of the lake." So they took Jesus in the boat and started out, leaving the crowds behind, although other boats followed. But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water. Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up, shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" Other translations, "Don't you care? We are perishing. Do you not even care about us?" When Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the water, "Silence, be still." Suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. And you would think that'd be the end of the story. The problem has been solved by Jesus again. But then Jesus asks them an important question, knowing there will be more storms. There will be more storms. And he asks them, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no trust in me? Do you still have no faith? Why are you afraid?" Now guess, they probably weren't even afraid when everything stopped. But really it's when you were experiencing the storm, but I was with you. Why were you afraid? And it concludes and says, the disciples were amazed. "Who is this man?" they ask each other, "that even the wind and waves obey him?" I told you already, this morning I felt like a baby deer trying to stand up. When I walked in here, I was struggling with some circumstances in my life that made me feel very, very much shakeable. And then the worship team was singing a song, and I just laid right over there in the chairs. I just laid there, closed my eyes, and I was reminding my heart of two things. This trouble is not forever, and the Lord is in my boat. And even though the circumstances didn't change, my heart was quieting down. The Lord wants to invite us to live a life where trouble around us does not have to become trouble within us. And the path to that is trust in the Lord who never fails. As we go into response, you'll see there's ways to respond in giving in the back as part of our worship unto the Lord. There's at both sides, we remember the work of Christ on our behalf on the cross. And so you can go and receive communion on both sides at the tables. Also, near the crosses, there'll be some of the leaders here from the church who would love to pray with you. If you're saying, look, maybe you're like, I feel like a stunted shrub, or I'm experiencing trouble and I need help to trust in the Lord. I need prayer that I can trust in God in the midst of my weakness. We'd love to pray with you. And in the midst of all of that, we are all going to be invited to respond to the Lord in worship as we sing a song that is such a great reminder. And the bridge of this song says, "I sought the Lord, and he heard, and he answered me. And that's why I trust him." Do you feel a need for the Lord? What a blessing. Are your other things of life proving unreliable for your security? What a blessing. That we can turn and say, once again, I seek the Lord. He hears and he answers. And because of this, I trust him. Let's pray. Lord, I know that in my own heart, I need to trust you more. I know, Lord, that circumstances of our culture, of my personal life often find their way and create in me a feeling much like the disciples in the boat. But Lord, I pray for us as a church family that you would more deeply reveal who you are and how much you have promised us, that we would walk through this next week of trouble and all the weeks with trouble ahead with hearts that are secure and unshakable because we trust in a God whose love is unshakable. We praise you. In Jesus' name, amen.